The night before this House last rose, Canadians received the news that one of the lions of Canadian politics had left us.
The Liberal candidate in Central Nova persistently referred to a candidate from Quebec who didn't live in his riding and lived in a $1 million house rent-free. And I want you to know, Prime Minister, I defended you vigorously. I think it was enough to make anybody take a walk in the snow.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Je donne maintenant la parole au très honorable.
I now recognize the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the night before this House last rose, Canadians received the news that one of the lions of Canadian politics had left us. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney served in this chamber for a decade, but he served Canada his entire life. He loved this country with his whole heart, and he knew we were capable of great things. He saw that the greatest strength of this country was our shared values: opportunity, fairness, and justice for all, was one of the ways he put it. But he also understood that success was not automatic. It took hard work. C'est grâce à son éthique de...
Thanks to his work ethic, the son of a Bécomo, blue-collar worker, was able to lead a mining company and ultimately became the Prime Minister of our great country. He was a proud Quebecer, proudly bilingual, and he never forgot his roots. He would shake anyone's hand with the same level of enthusiasm, whether it was a housewife, a worker, or a monarch.
To be with Prime Minister Mulroney was at his alma mater, St. FX, last year. Brian and Mila took me on a tour of Mulroney Hall, a beautiful building that houses an Institute of Government in his name. We sat in a replica of the Prime Minister's centre block office, and I reminisced not just about my own years in that office, but about visiting my dad there. And that got us talking about families and the impact that this life has on them. And then, as we walked, we talked about wisdom that he and my dad both shared, that leadership fundamentally is about getting the big things right. No matter what your political stripe or your style, that's your job. À l'une des occasions où il a parlé au...
When speaking at the funeral of an American president, he stated that many individuals with varied skills and strengths have led the country, and that there will be others to come. But one thing is certain. Historians will see that in the history of Canada, Brian Mulroney led with vision and determination. He accomplished many great things.
Legacy on apartheid, where he was unremitting in his commitment to end that institutionalized racism. And he leveraged Canada's position in the Commonwealth to lead efforts that helped free Nelson Mandela from his cell on Robben Island. Nous le voyons dans l'héritage.
We can see it in his legacy on the environment. He understood that governments are responsible for fighting the degradation of the environment, and he signed a historic agreement with the US on air quality to fight acid rain. With global partners, he negotiated the Montreal Protocol to close the hole in the ozone layer. These agreements were not just essential at the time. They have become models of environmental cooperation at a time when the international community is facing the climate crisis.
Greatest legacies was forging a free trade agreement with our closest ally, the United States. Prime Minister Mulroney was astute and perceived even back in the 80s a rising tide of American protectionism. He had the wisdom to understand that the best way to fight back was to embrace our friends. He envisioned a free trade relationship, and in working to make this vision a reality, he became a lifelong friend of 2 American presidents. With the creation of NAFTA, Brian Mulroney established the largest free trade area in the world and raised the standard of living for hundreds of millions of people, benefiting Canadians in every corner of this country for decades. Mais Brian savait aussi.
Brian also knew that you could take nothing for granted. He would say that you had to work every single day and every next day. And in that spirit, he took part when NAFTA was threatened a few years ago. He played a dual role. He was an advisor for my cabinet and for me, and he also played a role as a defender of Canada among the international and U.S. political elite.
But even more so to Canada, that Brian vouched to the American Republican class that they could trust this Liberal Prime Minister. And even given partisan political pressure here at home, he always knew that the most important thing was getting a good deal for Canada and for Canadians. In our many conversations during that difficult time, he was gracious, generous, insightful, and determined to see Canada come out on top. NAFTA was created as an act of hope. So too was its renegotiation. Hope not just in the continual economic progress of this country, but hope that those values that once held us together, opportunity and fairness for all, livelihood above gimmicks, country above politics, that those values could still be the thing. Politics is not an easy life. Last June, after he walked me around the exhibits that the Institute formed in his name, Brian gave a speech where he said, "I have learned over the years that history is unconcerned with the trivia and the trash of rumors and gossip floating around Parliament Hill. History is only concerned with the big-ticket items that have shaped the future of Canada." Prenons tous un moment.
Let us all take a moment to reflect on what we wish to accomplish here in this House. Let us recall how important it is to make good decisions regardless of the zeitgeist, decisions that will last and endure the test of time.
Office doesn't want to win. And Brian Mulroney knew how to win, and he certainly enjoyed it. And he knew as well as anyone that there would be attacks and criticisms that stung. Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, Nicholas, you saw it up close, and you know how hard it can be. But on the big things, you also know full well he wouldn't let himself succumb to temporary pressure. He was motivated by service. And those things, those big things, have stood the test of history 4 decades and counting. Today, we all gather to remember him in this House, and this weekend, Canadians across the country will say goodbye. But this will not be the last week that Canadians will quote him, remember his example, and be inspired by his service. It is not just his booming baritone that will forever echo in this chamber, but his values and his leadership. Nous disons au revoir.
We are saying goodbye to the man, but not to his conviction to put country before politics, his conviction to create possibilities, and his confidence in the infinite possibility of Canada.
And Mulroney's principles helped shape this nation and the world for the better, and we will all continue that work. Merci beaucoup.
L'honorable chef de...
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Je me lève à la chambre.
I rise today in the House to honour a son of Quebec and a great man from Canada.
About a year ago, my wife Anna and I were at a mechanic shop servicing our car about 30 minutes south of here. And as I went to pay, the mechanic said, "Oh, you're that conservative leader. You know, Brian Mulroney is a family friend of mine." And I said, "Oh, really? How do you know Brian Mulroney?" And he said, "Well, my dad was a miner at the iron ore company. And when Brian was the president, he used to spend a lot of time with the guys on the ground and ask their opinions, hear their stories, and most of all, get tips on how they could be running a better business." This was the kind of down-to-earth spirit that he brought, but more importantly than that spirit and collegiality with the workers on the ground was his incredible memory. You see, when that miner passed away, decades later, Brian called the family. What is so incredible about that phone call is that in the interim period, Brian Mulroney fought 2 leadership races, won 2 majority governments, shook hands and spent time with presidents, kings, queens, and other prime ministers, negotiated free trade deals, watched the end of the Cold War, sent our troops into the Persian Gulf, and with all that passing through his mind, he still remembered the miner from the iron ore company. That is kindness. That is humility. And you know where I think it came from? I think in that miner, he saw his dad, an electrician from a working class small town in Quebec, d'une ville.
From a working class town in Quebec, Bécamo.
Irish working class upbringing taught him the value of work, family, neighborhood, loyalty, and merit. For me, this part of his legacy is personal. I was born to a teenage mother, incidentally, she was from a working class Irish family. She put me up for adoption to 2 school teachers. And I was just becoming aware that there was such a thing as Prime Minister when he had that job. And like millions of young people from similar backgrounds, we looked to him and said, if the Irish son of a working class electrician from a mill town can rise to become Prime Minister, then in this country, anyone from anywhere can do anything. He took his journey from a small town to big business, leading some of the great enterprises of Canada. Many of these jobs he had in his late 30s and early 40s. His first shot at politics came with a setback, but he would brush aside that setback with a second run for leadership, which he would win before he could take on the mighty Liberal machine in the forthcoming 1984 election. Before he could do that, he had to come to this place. And on his first day in the House, he squared off with the legendary Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who teased him about parachuting from his corporate office in Montreal into a by-election win in rural Nova Scotia. If you'll allow me to quote the records, Mr. Speaker, the member from Central Nova has come a long way from that log cabin in Pictou County. I see he has put away his rumpled trousers and odd sweaters to be brought out again in the next election. But in the meantime, Madam Speaker, it is nice for us in this change to be able to bask in the glow of the benign smile of a man who sent such shivers of pleasure down the spines of the matrons all the way from Oyster Pond to Mushaboom. That's some good stuff. Then Mulroney had to rise and respond, and he said, "I want you to know, Prime Minister, that during the summer, while you were otherwise occupied, there was a very pleasant summer for me. There was one untoward incident, and only one. The Liberal candidate in Central Nova persistently referred to a candidate from Quebec who didn't live in his riding and lived in a $1 million house rent-free. And I want you to know, Prime Minister, I defended you vigorously." And when he appeared in this chamber with that big smile and confident tone, I think it was enough to make anybody take a walk in the snow. Soon after the election, he would go on, soon after he would win a record majority government. And he inherited a desperate, divided country, with skyrocketing debt having caused double-digit inflation, unemployment, and interest rates. Government had attacked industries and thousands of jobs. People's lives were falling apart. The country was more divided than ever before, with rocketing separatism and Western alienation. Yet he set out to do his work. He shrunk government, cut red tape, ended the appalling national energy program, privatized 23 money-losing state enterprises that went on to succeed and grow in the private sector. And to put any debate to rest, successive governments refused to renationalize any of them, proving that he was right. My personal favorite, he brought in the inflation control target, which required the Bank of Canada to keep our money solid, ending the prior decade of money printing inflation that had destroyed the working class. This policy, this inflation target, came in 1991 and would succeed in giving us price stability and sound money for 2.5 decades that followed. Finally, he stared down fear-mongering and falsehoods to defend and secure the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the most successful trade agreement the modern world had ever seen, with the most lucrative economy in the history of the planet. In fact, all of the trade access and more than we have today with the United States was secured in that agreement. Il a hérité d'un pays.
He inherited a desperate, divided country with public debt that had caused inflation, high unemployment, and increased interest rates. The government was attacking the private sector and had destroyed thousands of jobs. People's lives were falling apart, but he gave people hope. And yet, he sat down to the difficult task of reducing the size of government, reducing red tape, ending the terrible national energy program, and he privatized 23 state companies. These companies succeeded in the private sector, and successive governments have not renationalized any of those businesses. And as such, they've recognized that he was right. And my favorite was his decision to put in place a requirement to keep inflation low, to give that mandate to the central bank, 2.2%. That ended the money printing that had destroyed the working class in the previous decade. He put that policy in place in 1991, and it's a policy that has been respected, or was respected, for the following 25 years. Finally, he stood up for the idea of free trade with the United States, with an agreement that has been the most successful of all free trade agreements in the world, with an extraordinary economy. His economic policies created a consensus of good common sense, of free markets, of free trade, of disciplined spending, of a solid currency, of strong defense, and of a meritocracy and not an aristocracy. A consensus which lasted another 30 years following his election in 1984.
That he put forward, the ones I've named, all of them were controversial. Some were even unpopular, and yet none of them were repealed by the subsequent Liberal government. He, in fact, started in 1984, after his election, a common-sense consensus of free markets, free trade, disciplined spending, sound money, strong defense, meritocracy, and not aristocracy, a consensus that would endure for 30 years after his 1984 election, and one that we should restore. Il s'est battu pour la langue française.
He fought for the French language and for respect for Quebec, for provincial autonomy.
War neutrality, and instead sided firmly and unequivocally with freedom and against communism. He led the world in the fight against apartheid. Nelson Mandela would later tell this House of Commons, and I will quote, "I would also like to pay special tribute to the Prime Minister of this country, Brian Mulroney, who has continued along the path charted by Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who acted against apartheid because he knew that no person of conscience could stand aside as a crime against humanity was being committed. Prime Minister Mulroney, our people and organization respect and admire you as a true friend. We have been greatly strengthened by your involvement in the struggle against apartheid and the leadership that you have provided." He stood for the freedom at home as well. He stood on the side of turban-wearing Sikhs by allowing them to serve in the RCMP, where they keep us safe to this day. He was brilliant at talking through a microphone, but even better at talking through a telephone. In fact, for Brian Mulroney, phone calls were like an art form, using the telephone the way Michelangelo might have used a chisel or a brush. He would do it to make business deals, charm foreign leaders, and more importantly, to comfort grieving or suffering friends. I've lost count of the number of people who've told me about the worst day in their lives. They might have lost a loved one or a friend or suffered a terrible public humiliation. And then suddenly the phone would ring. And that would be that mellifluous baritone on the other end of the line. It's Brian Mulroney. He would console, joke, and maybe even throw in the odd curse about the unfairness of it all. And his friend's turmoil melted into the astonishment that one of the country's greatest prime ministers had offered love and laughter. I would call and seek his advice. In fact, I was very blessed to receive it. I asked him, for example, what is it that he did to deal with all the strain of the job, the anticipation of a close election, the worry about the fate of a political battle? His answer was not that he studied Stoicism or mastered yoga or meditated on a hilltop, or even that he was a tough guy that had no worries in the world. No, he explained to me very simple that he surmounted worry through one word: Mila. Mila Mulroney. His half-century-long love affair with Mila is one for the ages. They would have been married 52 years in just a short time. He credited her with all his victories. She was his closest advisor, his rock. Only days before he died, he embraced her, and even with his failing eyes, as she recounted to me the other day, he looked her straight in the face and said, "You are so beautiful." They were inseparable from the moment they met until he took his last breath. He would tell me that my wife, Anaida, who shared Mila's beautiful immigrant story, was my superpower. After my recent convention speech, he said, "My speech was terrific, but Anna's was far, far better." Clapping a little bit too loudly at that. Anna and I were happy to host the Mulroneys as our first guests at Stornoway after taking on these functions, and we were able to plunder both of their minds for incredible advice, which I will not reveal here because I do not want any of my political competitors to take advantage of them. But the best and most important advice was to stand with family. Brian and Mila's achievements are greatest when it comes to their kids, who tell stories even today that they could call Brian at any time, and he would take the calls even when he was Prime Minister. Later, they would find out that he had left world summits or cabinet meetings to talk with them. And that is why Mark, Caroline, Nicholas, and Ben have been such smashing successes in their own right. And they are now parents themselves, 16 grandchildren. Go forth and multiply indeed. And so he lived out the words of Kipling, which I will summarize and paraphrase. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. Or watch the things you gave your life to, broken, and stoop down and build them up with worn-out tools. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose your common touch. Yours is the earth and everything in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Rest in the peace of God, Prime Minister Mulroney. Thank you.